Fort Pitt stood at the meeting of two rivers, and what happened there in the summer of 1763 would echo far beyond its palisades, in politics, in medicine, and in the stories nations tell about themselves. Welcome. For the next 45 minutes we will move through smoke and ink, through military orders and native councils, through letters that tremble with fear and resolve. You will hear voices that were close to the ground, officers managing a fragile garrison, indigenous leaders defending homelands, traders watching alliances shift, and we will follow the threads that tie a single siege to a larger story of empire, disease, and contested memory. This is not a tale of simple villains and heroes. It is the messy, human intersection of military strategy and frontier life, of deliberate decisions and unpredictable forces. We will bring forward original documents, maps that change as lines of control change, and the careful work of historians who disagree about some of the most charged moments. There is a long-standing controversy, sometimes called the smallpox incident, in which British personnel at the fort appear, in contemporary notes, to have discussed and perhaps attempted to spread disease among nearby native communities. Some scholars read those entries as evidence of deliberate biological warfare. Others argue the context, intent, and outcome are far less clear. We will present the evidence, the arguments, and the limits of what the sources can tell us. Why watch? Because the story of Fort Pitt forces us to confront three intertwined questions: how empires wage war on distant frontiers, how disease reshapes confrontations in ways no commander can fully control, and how competing peoples remember the same events in different languages. By the end, you will understand not only the sequence of actions that defined the siege, but also how that episode influenced policy, settlement, and relations across the continent for years to come. You will see how everyday objects, a ledger, a stamped letter, a surgeon's note, become keys to understanding intentions and consequences. You will meet people whose choices mattered in real time and whose decisions were recorded, sometimes carelessly, in the margins of official business. And you will see how historians weigh those fragments to tell stories that are rigorous, humane, and cautious when claims remain contested. If you enjoy careful, reflective history told with attention to sources and to lives on the ground, consider subscribing for more narratives like this. Stay with me now as we step into the world around Fort Pitt, the muddy rivers, the creaking timber, the councils held in longhouses and tents, and the invisible currents of contagion and rumor that would change countless lives. Our first stop is the geography itself, the rivers, the trails, the fortifications, because from place come choices, and from choices come consequences. Hook plus brief greeting plus soft subscribe. A small bundle, handed across a rough table at the fort, entered the long story of how war, diplomacy, and disease shaped a frontier. Hello. Thank you for joining this careful look at a contested moment in North American history. If you find this exploration helpful, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful narratives. Fort Pitt stood where two great rivers meet, a strategic point carved from the contested ground of empire. The place was a fortress of wood and earth, built after a larger imperial struggle, intended to command waterways and trade. It became the focal point of a wider uprising by native nations who challenged British policies on land, trade, and sovereignty. The siege that settled around the fort brought hunger, tension, and a series of parleying visits, not only from warriors but from envoys seeking terms and reassurance. At one such parley, a trader kept a simple record. His entry describes giving 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the smallpox hospital to native representatives as gifts. The name recorded in that journal is William Trent. That single line in a trader's ledger has, over the centuries, become one of the most debated documents in discussions of early biological warfare in North America. Trent's note is clear in its basic detail, but what it implies has been the subject of careful scholarly scrutiny ever since. Contemporary correspondence among British officers adds a broader frame to that ledger. Commanders in distant headquarters discussed methods that would blunt native resistance and protect garrisons on the frontier. One senior officer suggested considering whether smallpox might be introduced among hostile groups. The language in those letters is blunt enough to have attracted attention, yet the chain from suggestion to action is not a simple straight line. The documentary trail is fragmentary, and historians have had to weigh partial records against the realities of medicine and logistics in a period before germ theory. Historians who argue that this was an intentional effort point to the combination of recorded suggestions from command and the trader's entry as evidence of a deliberate tactic. They emphasize the ethical dimensions, that leaders contemplated and, on at least one occasion, executed a plan to use disease as a weapon. Those conclusions rest on the convergence of several primary sources and on the broader context of a brutal contest over land and control. Others urge caution. They note that smallpox was already present on the continent, and that outbreaks followed many patterns shaped by trade networks, seasonal travel, and prior exposures. They point out that the efficacy of transferring smallpox through clothing is debated among medical historians, and that a single act does not necessarily explain the complex epidemiology that followed. The human consequences, whatever the precise chain of causation, were profound across the frontier. Communities that had already suffered waves of disease in preceding decades found themselves vulnerable to new epidemics. The siege itself placed pressure on food and supplies, and the breakdown of trust between native nations and British officials hardened attitudes on both sides. Diplomacy turned brittle. Long-standing trade relationships frayed and were too often replaced by punitive military expeditions and aggressive settlement policies. The ripple effects touched families, hunters traveling long distances, and the fragile economies of frontier life. Legal and moral questions flowed from these events into later debates about conduct in war. Was it lawful to contemplate using disease as a tactic? Did commanders accept a different ethical standard when dealing with native nations versus European foes? Those questions have been pressed by modern scholars and by descendant communities seeking recognition and explanation. Museums, archives, and historians have approached the subject with care, presenting primary documents and laying out contested interpretations rather than proclaiming a single definitive narrative. Concrete examples help to clarify the stakes. The trader's entry stands in a repository alongside letters from high command that express exasperation at the difficulty of securing the vast frontier. Parleys recorded in multiple accounts describe native leaders coming under flags of truce to discuss terms, only to find negotiations colored by suspicion. Military dispatches speak of attempts to resupply and reinforce the fortress, and diplomatic notes reveal efforts to broker peace by offering trade concessions or hostages. Each of these strands, military, medical, diplomatic, interwove ways that made the frontier a volatile space. Scholarly work has moved beyond simple accusation or dismissal. Research in medical history has explored the biology of smallpox transmission, showing how contagion could travel along trading paths and how immunity varied across populations. Archival historians have painstakingly traced letters and journals to reconstruct timelines. Ethnohistorians have emphasized the agency of native nations, their ability to form confederacies, to negotiate, to carry out their own strategies, and to suffer distinct and long-lasting impacts from the loss of elders and leaders to disease. Oral histories and tribal records, where available, add voices that written European accounts do not capture. Public memory of these events has shifted over time. Where earlier narratives sometimes downplayed the possibility of deliberate infection, later interpretations have taken the trader's note and command correspondence seriously as evidence of intent. At the same time, responsible historical interpretation resists oversimplification. There is room to recognize both the moral injury suggested by the documents and the scientific uncertainties about causation. That dual recognition allows for a more honest reckoning with the past and a more careful dialogue about responsibility and memory. The site of the fort itself changed with the years. What was once a military bastion became a hub of settlement and commerce, evolving into a city whose growth was fed by the very rivers that made the place strategic. The legacy of conflict and disease nonetheless persisted in treaties, in settler expansion, and in the narratives passed between communities. Today, scholars, curators, and descendants engage in research and conversation to better understand how a few lines in a ledger connect to the broader sweep of frontier life and imperial policy. This is not a simple story of cause and effect. It is a knot of decisions, misfortunes, and structural pressures, military orders, trader records, diplomatic failings, and biological vulnerability. Each piece matters. The trader's entry matters. The letters from command matter. The rhythms of trade and movement matter. The remembered losses matter. And in weighing these, historians seek to balance evidence with restraint, acknowledging what can be demonstrated while pointing out where uncertainty remains. Thank you for listening to this close look at an episode that still matters. If you'd like more examinations that combine primary sources with careful interpretation, please subscribe, gently, to follow along. Frontier Tensions and Pontiac's War Context. When imperial priorities shifted after the Long Continental War, the Ohio country turned into a tinderbox where diplomacy, trade, and survival collided. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this kind of deep historical narrative compelling, please consider subscribing for more. British victory in North America removed a rival power, but it did not remove rivalry itself. New rules, new commanders, and new settlers arrived, and with them came expectations that often directly contradicted those of the native societies who had long governed these lands through kinship, ceremony, and reciprocal exchange. Across the frontier, relationships that had been shaped by decades of gift-giving and reciprocal trade began to fray. The French had maintained alliances in part by supplying goods, guns, ammunition, cloth, rum, and metal tools, within established protocols of exchange. British officers and officials, chastened by war debts and convinced that colonial economies could be tighter managed, cut into those practices. The cutting of gifts and the restriction of credit were not mere administrative decisions. They changed how power and prestige were reproduced among indigenous nations. Chiefs who had used European goods to cement alliances found their ability to do so undermined. Men who had relied on trade goods to support their households and to sustain hunting parties faced brittle alternatives. Austerity reached into the military chain of command. Correspondence between senior officers reveals a pragmatic, sometimes brutal calculus. Letters survive in which British commanders discussed ways to reduce the ability of native confederacies to mount sustained resistance. One line of discussion, preserved in colonial archives, concerned whether disease could be used to weaken hostile forces. Those exchanges, while fragmentary, connect to a single documented incident at a frontier garrison where attempts to use contaminated materials during a parley were recorded by a quartermaster in his journal. That entry stands as one of the clearest contemporary pieces of evidence that British actors contemplated, and in one instance enacted, biological measures. Scholars read that entry alongside broader correspondence and with great caution. Some interpret it as deliberate policy, while others urge a more cautious reading that considers the chaotic, rumor-rich environment of frontier warfare. Encroachment by settlers added an explosive human dimension. Men and families from the eastern colonies pushed west along rivers and over ridgelines, clearing fields and claiming land in ways that clashed with indigenous land use and conceptions of territory. Land companies sought deeds. Colonial officials often lacked the resources or will to enforce boundaries. The British Crown attempted to impose a boundary line with proclamations and patrols, but enforcement was inconsistent and residents who had invested labour and hope in western lots resisted any curtailment. This created a twofold grievance. Native communities watched familiar hunting grounds shrink and treaty terms drift, while colonists saw their claims and ambitions frustrated by a distant administration that they believed favoured restraint over reward. Against this backdrop, leaders across the region began to talk in new terms. A loose alliance of nations, Ottawa, Delaware, Wyandotte, and others, cooperated to varying degrees, motivated by shared concerns over land, trade, and the perceived arrogance of British officers and settlers. The man whose name is often attached to the Confederacy was a catalyst, a charismatic leader who brokered talks and encouraged coordinated actions around major posts. He did not, by most accounts, command every action of every nation involved, but he articulated a strategy that framed British forts and supply lines as legitimate targets. Where diplomacy had once relied on a steady flow of gifts and face-to-face negotiations, the strategy became one of cutting off leverage, seizing forts, embargoing trade, and demonstrating that British control was neither inevitable nor benign. At Fort Pitt, at the strategic confluence of rivers that funneled people and goods, tensions were particularly acute. The fort replaced an earlier French stronghold and became a symbol of imperial presence on the Ohio. That symbolic weight made it a focal point for both military planning and indigenous resistance. The garrison's records show a community under strain, shortages, anxiety about supplies, and a steady flow of reports about disturbances along river corridors. Those records also preserve the episode that would become the most debated. During a parley with representatives of a local nation, items taken from a military hospital were handed over by garrison personnel. A quartermaster's account notes these exchanges. Later correspondents higher in the chain discuss the possibility of broader application. Historians treat the Trent Journal entry and the Amherst Bouquet letters as crucial documentary evidence. Yet they also read these sources in context. Procurement notes, war fever, and the limited medical understanding of contagion at the time all shape interpretation. Disease was an omnipresent reality on the frontier long before it was ever discussed as a weapon. Epidemics of smallpox and other maladies had periodically swept through native communities and colonial settlements alike, sometimes with catastrophic demographic effects. Indigenous populations faced repeated outbreaks over generations, and the introduction of European pathogens had already altered community structures and power balances. When talk of using contaminated materials emerged, therefore, it fed into existing fears and memories. Some historians argue that contemporary actors deliberately sought to use disease as an instrument, citing explicit proposals in correspondence. Others emphasize uncertainty. Inoculation practices were becoming known in European medical circles, and notions of contagion were only partially understood. Accidents were common, and the movement of sick people, furs, and goods could spread infection without malicious intent. The truth may be layered: intent in some quarters, accident in others, and a shared context of vulnerability throughout. The military judgments made on the frontier reflected more than cold strategy. They reflected ignorance and desperation, too. Quartermasters and captains ran short of powder and shot. Officials feared that a chain reaction of seized posts would leave the colonies exposed. At the same time, native leaders were confronting not simply foreign soldiers, but a fundamentally altered supply regime that threatened the very social transactions that legitimized leadership. The resulting violence mixed conventional siege tactics with raids and ambushes, and it was fueled as much by miscommunication as by malice. Contemporary observers, missionaries, traders, and military men left accounts that reveal a theater of mutual suspicion. Each side often misread gestures and inferred intentions in ways that hardened positions. Existing scholarship continues to debate how singular or systematic acts like those recorded at Fort Pitt really were. Epidemiologists, archivists, and indigenous scholars have all contributed to a complex picture. Some draw direct lines from the documented transfer of contaminated materials to outbreaks among specific communities, pointing to timing and patterns in the archival record. Others point out gaps: incomplete mortality records, simultaneous exposure through other channels, and the long history of smallpox epidemics that make attribution difficult. Oral histories, where available, carry their own weight and sometimes diverge from written colonial testimony. Taken together, the sources underscore a broader reality. The frontier was not merely a battleground. It was also a laboratory of policies and practices whose consequences were often unforeseeable and frequently tragic. Examples from contemporary correspondence highlight how fragile peace had become. Officers wrote of the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in a landscape of mixed alliances and of conducting parley under threat of ambush. Traders complained that their routes were no longer safe. Chiefs who had once counted on steady trade goods found their authority questioned when gifts stopped arriving. In several recorded instances, emissaries were treated with great caution, greeted with formal protocol, then kept from removing themselves or their parties from the fort's perceived sphere of control. Those interactions were theatre as much as diplomacy, and they reveal how ritualized exchanges had been transformed into tests of power. What emerges most starkly is a picture of a frontier in transition, a place where imperial policy, settler ambition, indigenous sovereignty, and human vulnerability met and clashed. The question of whether disease was deliberately used as a weapon at Fort Pitt is a window into that larger struggle. It forces us to look at letters, journals, proclamations, and oral memories together, to weigh intent alongside consequence, plan against accident, and documented proposal against practical execution. The episode also illuminates how colonial administrators resolved, or failed to resolve, moral and strategic dilemmas when faced with a potentially existential threat. There is no tidy resolution in the archives. For some communities, the impact was immediate and devastating. For others, the outbreak patterns suggest multiple vectors of transmission. In the field of historiography, scholars continue to probe the documentary record with new tools and perspectives, and indigenous scholars insist that oral testimony and community memory must be part of any account. All of these approaches push toward a fuller understanding, one that recognizes the violence of dispossession and also attends to the ambiguous, often improvisational character of frontier warfare. As a consequence, the conflict that enveloped Fort Pitt should be seen less as an isolated atrocity and more as a node in a broader weave of policies and responses. The talk of biological means emerged from a particular set of grievances and scarcities. It traveled through cramped quarters and into journals. It crossed into decisions made under duress. And whether those decisions were decisive in the spread of disease or simply one factor among many, they nonetheless reflect an era in which the balance between empire and indigenous lifeways was being renegotiated under conditions of fear and scarcity. The story of frontier tensions and the context of the Confederate uprising that coalesced around Pontiac is not a single moral parable. Rather, it is a study in how institutional choices interact with human networks, how trade, honor, and survival practices intersect during moments of upheaval. It shows how small administrative changes, such as halting gifts or tightening trade, can catalyze broad resistance when they strike at the foundations of social order. And it shows how, amid that upheaval, both deliberate and accidental actions could produce consequences that echo far beyond any single fort. Thank you for staying with this exploration. If you would like more narratives that blend archival detail with lived experience, please consider subscribing. There are many more stories from the frontier waiting to be told. Fort Pitt, location, people, and stakes. When European armies and indigenous confederacies measured the Ohio country by its rivers, a single point of land where two streams met and made a third commanded attention like a lighthouse on a dark coast. Hello, thanks for listening. If you want more careful stories like this, please subscribe and you'll get them. Fort Pitt sat where the Allegheny and the Monongahela joined to form the Ohio, a place that was already ancestral ground for many nations and a vital artery for trade, diplomacy, and war. The fort's location was not accidental. It was chosen with clear-eyed calculation. Control the waterways and you control movement, commerce, and access to the vast interior. The physical setting shaped every decision. A high, grassy point looked out over three converging currents, offering a commanding view up both tributaries and downriver toward regions that reached to the Ohio's farthest bends. From that promontory one could see canoes hugging the shore, packhorses fording shallow points, and the smoke of villages tucked into ravines. The rivers were highways. Supplies, furs, messages, and people moved along them in every season. Whoever held that point could intercept trade, inspect travelers, and assert a presence that resonated far beyond its stone and timber walls. The fort itself rose from a landscape of mixed forest and river marshes. Timber palisades, bastions for cannon, and earthen works were arranged to make the most of the slope toward the rivers. That slope mattered because a landing was the first contact between overseas arms and inland peoples. A well-placed battery could guard a supply convoy. A gate on the riverfront could admit traders and deny raiders. The site also sat close to portage paths, short overland routes that linked the headwaters of one watercourse to another, making it a choke point for any movement between the Atlantic seaboard and the western interior. For those who relied on trade goods, pelts, or military stores, the fort was a gateway and a threat at once. People gave the place meaning. Within the walls, a garrison of regular soldiers, provincial militiamen, camp followers, and civilian employees kept watch. Many were young men far from home, wearing red or buff, armed, drilled, and waiting for orders. Some were professional soldiers from continental units. Others were frontier recruits who knew rivers and woods as well as a parade ground. Among them was the fort's commander, an officer tasked with holding the structure and preserving lines of supply. He had to balance discipline and diplomacy, the roar of cannon and the protocols of parley. Officers shared duty with surgeons, traders, and clerks who managed the flow of goods that sustained the post. Outside and around the fort stood a dense web of indigenous nations whose lives had long been woven through that geography. Delaware, Shawnee, Mingo, Wyandot, Odawa, and other nations frequented the same river corridors, some for centuries. Those peoples were hunters and farmers, diplomats, and warriors. They had obligations to families, to villages, and to an extended world of alliances and obligations. Their perspective on the fort was shaped by years of shifting trade relationships, by memories of French trade and gift-giving that had encouraged friendly ties, and by new British policies that abruptly reoriented how access to goods, guns, and credit worked. Many saw the fort as an instrument of a colonial order that no longer acknowledged customary practices. Where Europeans saw a strategic outpost, indigenous communities saw a constricting presence that altered access to land and resources. Traders formed another crucial human thread. Men like George Croghan, who worked as an Indian agent and middleman, moved between the fort and indigenous towns, negotiating exchanges of beaver and beads, rum and iron. These traders kept the lifeblood of frontier economies flowing. They also carried news and gossip, and sometimes acted as envoys or interpreters in tense meetings. Their stores, often at the fort's riverfront, supplied both soldiers and visitors, and their fortunes rose and fell with the vagaries of demand and diplomacy. When the supply chain was interrupted, traders felt it first, and then the ripple extended to villages, where shortages of tools or salt could have cascading effects. Civilians, women, children, and families of soldiers and traders occupied a precarious space. Their lives were bound to the routines of the post, the grind of daily tasks, the exchange of letters, the cooking fires, the washing of clothes, the concern for vegetable gardens and livestock. They formed informal networks of aid and gossip, and their presence meant that the fort was not merely a military installation but a small community. When tensions rose, the question of civilian safety complicated decisions. Could the garrison hold out without civilian evacuation? Should provisions be rationed for soldiers first? These were not theoretical queries. They were lived dilemmas that shaped morale and choices. The stakes extended well beyond the timber and cannon. At the most immediate level, The fort was about control of the rivers and the trade along them, furs that fed European markets, supplies that sustained settlements, and the movement of people who would claim new farms and towns. Economically, whoever dominated that point could regulate the flow of goods and influence prices and alliances. Politically, the fort symbolized the imposition of a new regime after a larger imperial conflict. For British officials, it represented consolidation of victory across a contested continent. For indigenous nations, it symbolized the sudden collapse of old balances, a visible marker of a power that no longer practiced the same reciprocal gift diplomacy that had characterized relationships with the French. Security and sovereignty were entangled. Indigenous confederacies saw the fort as a threat to sovereignty, an assertion that land and waterways could be controlled without their consent. Settlers on the frontier perceived the fort as protective. It stood between farmsteads and raids, and it offered a place to store supplies and to muster victims of violence. These perspectives collided in parley, in ambush, and in the negotiation of peace and surrender. Each canon and each treaty clause was a language of power. The fort's presence forced every actor to reassess alliances and strategies. Disease and diplomacy intersected with these stakes in ways that historians still debate. Medical officers and surgeons worked within crowded quarters where illness could spread, and the movement of people brought contagion along with trade. Records show exchanges and encounters that raised difficult questions about intent and consequence. Traders and officers kept journals. Letters passed between colonial administrators and officers in the field. Those documents sit at the heart of contested interpretations. Did certain actions represent deliberate attempts to introduce disease, or were they desperate measures in a chaotic struggle? Different scholars weigh the sources differently. Some emphasize clear documentary traces that suggest intent. Others caution that surviving papers are fragmentary and must be read with care. The result is a debate that is as much about interpretation as it is about events. Command decisions at the fort were shaped by logistic limits. Supplies arrived slowly, and the rivers themselves could be fickle, low, or choked with ice, or high and dangerous. The garrison had to manage rations, ammunition, and the morale of its people. Reinforcements from distant garrisons were uncertain, and the landscape itself favored those familiar with the woods. Besiegers could harass supply lines and watch for patterns in patrols. A well-timed raid on a convoy could starve a garrison into acquiescence. Conversely, a relief column could break a siege and reassert control, as subsequent actions in the region would decisively demonstrate. Diplomacy could be lethal, too. Parley was a ritual filled with risk and possibility. Envoys crossed open ground under flags and with tokens of relation. Speeches were made, gifts exchanged, promises given, and sometimes broken. Those meetings were where misunderstandings multiplied and where cultural protocols could prevent open bloodshed. Yet the language of ceremony could mask deeper strategic aims. Each gift had meaning. Each refusal signaled a rupture. The fort's commanders and the indigenous leaders both used diplomacy to probe intentions and to buy time. The human stories that radiate from the fort are many and textured. There were traders who negotiated for the survival of their families, officers who balanced duty and conscience, and indigenous leaders who sought to preserve land and autonomy against overwhelming pressure. Local villagers watched and decided whether to flee, to fight, or to negotiate. Some chose accommodation, others resistance. Families made harrowing choices about whether to abandon gardens and homesteads or to hold them and risk raids. These were decisions grounded in the immediate. Will the crops be harvested? Will the children be safe? Yet they also touched on grander questions. Who would hold title to land? Who would decide the rules of trade? And what would future generations inherit? Material culture at the fort reflected these interactions. Trade goods bore European makers' marks yet were adapted to indigenous tastes. Metal knives and kettles sat beside wampum strings and beadwork. The fort storehouses contained powder, shot, and provisions, but they also stored presents meant to secure friendship: cloth, calico, and the trinkets that signaled alliance. Archaeological finds from the point show fragments that testify to daily life as much as to conflict: ceramics, lead shot, and fragments of tobacco pipes. Each artifact links an individual to a daily practice, a conversation, or a choice. Memory and legacy are a final kind of stake. The narratives that emerged after the siege shaped how communities understood themselves. For settlers, stories of defense and survival fed into a frontier identity of resilience. For indigenous peoples, the episode became a chapter in a longer history of resistance and loss. Later narratives would frame the point as the beginning of a city and a nation's westward expansion. But beneath those broad strokes lie the immediate consequences. Families uprooted, alliances rearranged, and a landscape gradually transformed by the confluence of military power, commerce, and migration. All of these threads, geography, people, and stakes, converged at that point of land. The fort was not only a military work, it was a fulcrum where ambitions met habits, where economies collided, and where survival hung on the management of supplies, the conduct of diplomacy, and the capacity to hold or to yield ground. In the conversations that took place there, paper and rum and metal goods bore as much weight as muskets. The decisions made, the parley offers accepted or refused, the trade agreements struck or broken, shaped a region for decades to come. There is a modern echo worth noting. Today, that same confluence hosts a city whose skyline and culture grew from the tangled history of trade and conflict, compromise, and coercion. Remnants of the fort's footprint are interpreted at parks and museums, where visitors learn how rivers shaped history and how people, on both sides of the palisade, lived through peril and negotiation. Archaeology continues to add detail, and archival scholarship continues to revise understandings of who did what and why. Scholars still sift through letters and journals to tease apart intention from happenstance, and descendants of those who acted then continue to carry forward memories and perspectives that are not easily summarized. There is no single moral ledger to close. Rather, the fort story is a knot of motives and actions. Each actor operated with limited information and immediate pressures. Some sought control, some sought preservation, and many sought only survival. The fort's location made those aims unavoidable and urgent. What happened on that point of land mattered because it influenced how people moved, traded, and governed afterward. So when you trace the riverbanks in your mind, think of more than an arbitrary bend. Consider a place where roots met, where economies collided, and where people made consequential choices under pressure. The fort story begins with a river confluence and expands into a human drama of allies and adversaries, of traders and diplomats, of families and soldiers, all negotiating what the future of the Ohio country would look like. If you found this close look helpful, stay with us for more. Subscribe for further explorations, and thank you for listening. The siege begins. Fear and shortages. Fort Pitt sat where two rivers met, a place of strategic promise and sudden pressure. The fort's wooden walls and earthworks rose above lowlands that for years had been a crossroads of trade, diplomacy, and conflict. When the frontier outside the palisade grew tense, people fled inward. Traders, displaced farming families, soldiers released from distant garrisons. The stockade became a refuge, and refuge meant crowding, and crowding meant strains on every supply line that had once seemed manageable. Hello, and thank you for joining this telling. If you find value in this story, a quiet subscription helps more than you might think. Behind the immediate clatter of muskets and the bark of orders, there was a softer, more pervasive sound, the hush of worry. Rumors moved faster than official reports. Word of attacks, of burned cabins, of ambushed patrols, reached the fort in bursts, from frightened settlers who arrived on foot, from scouts who came back with grim faces, and from traders whose wagons had been turned away. Each arrival brought a new tally of losses and a new list of needs. The commanding officers catalogued these arrivals. They tallied men who could stand guard, women and children who needed shelter, and livestock that could not be fed. The ledger of fear was as real as any roll call. Shortages sharpened everything. Flour ran thin. Salt, indispensable for preserving meat and for morale, was hoarded and rationed. Gunpowder, the lifeblood of defense, was measured out in small portions, and even then seized for immediate use. Ammunition was conserved like a precious resource. When men described the situation later, they used words such as precarious and urgent. Supply wagons that once traversed between forts and settlements found their routes ambushed or abandoned. Traders who usually carried trade goods, blankets, metal tools, trinkets, began to keep their stores close, fearful of both theft and seizure. A network of supply, built over years, frayed in weeks. Inside the fort the organization looked purposeful. Sentries kept their posts. Men rotated into the walls to look for signs of movement in the tree line. Watchfires burned through the night at intervals. But purposefulness did not erase fatigue. Many who arrived were not soldiers. Women and children crowded into barracks carved out of available space. Cooking shifted from scattered hearths into centralized kitchens where portions could be stretched. Families who had been self-sufficient on small farms were suddenly dependent on the fort stores. There was embarrassment, too, for men who had once been heads of households to stand in line for bread. Yet this dependence was also a quiet bond, knitting disparate people into a temporary community defined by a common strain. Leaders made choices that affected survival. The commanding officer faced a constant calculus: how many men to spare for patrols, how many to keep at the walls, how much powder could be risked on an offensive sortie, how much food could be given to non-combatants. At times decisions were dictated by desperation. Patrols that once would have been routine were now planned only with great concern. A foraging party might be needed to gather fresh meat, but the risk of ambush meant such missions required 2 or 3 times the usual escort. Every sortie reduced the number of defenders on the ramparts. Every ration extended into the next uncertain day. There were attempts at negotiation outside the palisade. Messengers went back and forth. Native leaders came to the gates under flags of truce, or at least under parley, to speak with the garrison. The language exchanged in those talks was layered with meaning: promises, demands, warnings, and subtle tests of strength. In some instances, the parley served as a stalling tactic, allowing besieging forces to gauge the fort's resolve while also probing for weaknesses. In others, emissaries sought tangible assurances, like trade goods or safe passage, hoping to secure advantages without a direct assault. These moments at the gate were fraught. Sentries watched closely, and both sides read any hesitation or generosity carefully. Gifts could soothe or inflame. A well-timed present could end a confrontation. A perceived slight could renew hostilities. Disease hovered over every decision as well, though its presence was sometimes invisible and often disputed. Forts were crowded by nature, and crowded places are where communicable illnesses find purchase. Within the stockade, infirmaries filled slowly. Some illnesses arrived as the inevitable consequence of stress and crowded conditions. Others were linked to more controversial actions taken in the hope of weakening opposing forces beyond the walls. Primary records from inside the fort document an exchange of items taken from the medical supplies. A trader who kept a journal noted that a pair of blankets and a handkerchief, items taken from the fort hospital, were given to visiting emissaries. This entry has been cited repeatedly by historians as clear evidence that leaders inside the fort entertained and enacted measures designed to spread disease among their rivals. The exchange itself is a critical primary example. A trader's brief account mentions the transfer in plain terms. It records the items given and the context, a parley between fort representatives and visiting delegates. That entry is a piece of paper. It is not a verdict. It shows an act, and the act raises questions about intent and outcome. Some contemporaries saw such gifts as legitimate tokens in diplomacy. Others saw them as instruments of deliberate harm. Historians today continue to debate the degree to which the exchange caused subsequent outbreaks among the surrounding indigenous communities. Epidemiology, incomplete records, and the movement of people all complicate the picture. What the documents do show is that those inside the fort were not unaware of disease as a weapon, and that at least some officers were willing to consider using disease in ways that crossed lines of conventional warfare. Fear, in that environment, had a tangible anatomy. It bent people's behaviors. Mothers who had once let children run loose kept them close. Men who might have pursued rebels in the surrounding woods settled for shorter patrols, preferring the security of the ramparts. Food distribution became a matter of strict accounting. The fort's quartermaster recorded allocations and receipts with a punctilious hand. When flour shipments failed to arrive, the ledger's margins filled with shorthand explanations: delayed, raided, lost. The names of homesteads on the nearby road vanished from patrol reports, their owners either dead, driven away, or hiding. Loss of agricultural output outside the fort multiplied anxieties about future shortages. Leadership was contested within the walls. Some officers favored a hard line: sally forth, punish the attackers, and send a message that the fort would not be a passive target. Others advised caution, citing the lack of reliable reinforcements and the degree of civilian vulnerability inside the palisade. Debates were not purely military. They were ethical, fiscal, and practical. Men argued over the use of live ammunition versus warning shots. They questioned whether to burn grain stock to prevent it falling into enemy hands, or to conserve it for those within. These arguments shaped the fort's posture. They also revealed differing visions about what the frontier was becoming: a contested zone where military, commercial, and domestic life collided. Sentries described something else as well: a psychological siege that did not depend solely on physical cutting off of supplies. Smoke from distant burning cabins, seen at dawn, pierced morale. The knowledge that neighbors were suffering acted as both motivator and demoralizer. Soldiers who had once seen the frontier as a place of opportunity now spoke of it with a new vocabulary: dangerous, uncertain, unforgiving. Families that had fled into the fort whispered about farms razed and crops destroyed. In that whispered litany were the seeds of long-term change. People began to see permanence in the fort's protection, and permanence altered how land was perceived and used. Practical responses multiplied. Walls were shored up. Timber was stripped from nearby stands to build palisades and abatis. Loopholes were cut into palisade logs to permit firing without exposing bodies. Cannons were sited and blacksmiths worked around the clock to repair and fashion parts. Trade goods, when still available, were repurposed as appeasements or bribes to coax local bands to hold back their attacks. Even mundane items, nails, kettles, lengths of cloth, gained new strategic value. Every confiscated or redistributed item was catalogued like a soldier's life. Men on watch kept lists of what went out and what came in. Outside, the besieging coalition tested the fort in its own ways. They harassed supply lines. They attempted to intercept messengers. They tried to cut off small parties that went to fetch wood or water. They also used tactics of negotiation and deception. Some leaders preferred to starve a garrison into submission by preventing trade and resupply rather than risking heavy losses in direct assaults. That strategy could be effective because the garrison's capacity to hold out depended not only on fortifications but on external logistics. In the days before telegraph and fast naval resupply, the trickle of essential goods could morph into a drought. The presence of non-combatants complicated military calculus outrageously. Soldiers had to guard gates, yes, but they also had to defend the lives of children and the weak. When the decision came to ration bread, an officer would have to decide whether to give a larger share to a wounded man or to divide it equally among a family. These decisions were never easy. They tore at the fabric of discipline and compassion. A fort's commander risked losing the loyalty of his own people if perceived as callous. But according to journals and letters of the time, commanders sometimes chose the cold logic of survival, because if the garrison fell entirely, compassion would offer neither protection nor sustenance at all. Information moved imperfectly and slowly, and that produced another kind of shortage, scarcity of certainty. Reports arrived in drips. A scout's brief note could be contradicted an hour later by a different eyewitness. Orders from officers outside the immediate command structure could arrive days too late, and by then the situation inside had changed. That lag forced leaders to act decisively with incomplete information. They had to weigh rumors against facts, and they had to judge whether a rumor deserved mobilization. Often the safest course was to assume the worst, to put extra men on guard, to shorten patrols, to conserve powder. Assumption became policy. There were also acts of private mercy that did not make it into broad strategic narratives, but which mattered intensely to those involved. A blacksmith might slip extra rations to an ailing neighbor. A trader might trade a coveted blanket for a promise to keep a family warm during a bitter night. An officer, in a quiet moment, might arrange for a midwife to remain with a woman in labor. These small gestures knitted a community that otherwise the stress threatened to unravel. They were micro-resistances to fear. The siege tested not only supply chains but belief systems. People inside the walls sometimes interpreted misfortunes as portents. Sermons at makeshift services took on urgent tones. Men sought meaning and explanation for why their world had changed so abruptly. Some saw moral failings abroad, others blamed policy from distant centers of power, and others blamed particular individuals or tribes. That search for meaning influenced decisions. If the siege was interpreted as divine judgment, then leaders might favor penance. If it was seen purely as political retribution, the call would be for stronger military action. These interpretations mattered little to the stove or the empty grain barrel, but they mattered very much to morale and cohesion. When the fort shared news with the outside world, it was with caution. Official dispatches emphasized order and resilience. That was partly to ensure that relief parties would not be dissuaded from attempting to bring help. Private letters, by contrast, carried more of the raw atmosphere. The nights punctuated by alarms, the day-to-day economizing, the weariness. Both public and private reports together form the mosaic historians examine. From that mosaic emerges a clear image. Siege conditions were as much about psychological compression as about physical deprivation. Controversy about contentious measures, particularly those tangential to disease, remained. Some documents show officers recommending or authorizing exchanges that today look like early forms of biological warfare. Other records suggest that outbreaks in indigenous communities were already underway and that trade and travel could just as easily have been mechanisms of spread as intentional gifts. Modern epidemiologists point out that smallpox can take time to incubate and that vectors are complex. Some scholars stress that the fort's actions, whether intentional or not, happened against a background of already devastating epidemics that had been moving through the region. There is no single clean answer. What exists are fragments of decisions, fragments of outcomes, and the human records that recorded them. Through it all, fear and shortages created an environment where decisions were sharper and mistakes more costly. The fort's defenders were acutely aware of the stakes. Every ration held beyond its means might save a life another day, but would leave less for the next day's struggle. Every parley might buy time and safety or could offer a fatal distraction. Every transfer of goods across the gate could be an act of diplomacy or a vector of harm. The gravity of each small action could not be predicted with certainty, but everyone felt its weight. By the time relief would later come, the memory of those weeks inside the palisade lingered among survivors as a time when ordinary rhythms of life were suspended. The wooden walls had witnessed debates over ethics, strategies, and survival. They had absorbed the calls of the sentries, the prayers of the devout, and the whispered consolations of neighbors. The fort had been a crucible. People left with stories of courage and criticism alike, of kindnesses and of measures that, to future generations, would raise stark questions about conduct on a troubled frontier. There are lessons threaded through those stories, not moralizing ones but observational. Small communities under strain reorganize quickly. Scarcity forces trading of values in new ways. Fear is both a reactive force and a weapon. The siege, in its narrow frame of weeks and months, amplified choices that were always present on the frontier. It compressed them into a focused narrative that future historians and storytellers have grappled with, and will continue to, because it raises questions about survival, strategy, and human judgment when circumstances are extreme. If you enjoyed the depth of this exploration, please consider subscribing for more historical narratives told in an attentive way. Thank you for listening. Messages, negotiations, and strategy. When the British garrison at Fort Pitt found itself cut off and under constant threat, communications became as important as gunpowder. Hello, and thank you for joining this close look at the fragile, urgent world of messages, negotiations, and strategy during that tense season. If you enjoy careful examinations of the past, please consider subscribing for more stories like this. Couriers traveled through a landscape that offered no neat boundaries, where river forks and trails were lines of supply and lines of intelligence at once. The fort's commanders relied on runners and canoe-borne messengers to carry reports of hostile movements, requests for reinforcements, and proposals for parleys. Messages moved both ways. Native leaders sent emissaries to probe British intentions, while British officers dispatched envoys to test the degrees of division and alliance among different tribes. These exchanges were often brief and coded by custom. A promise of trade goods could signal conciliation. A withheld gift could be read as an insult or prelude to attack. Interpretive skill mattered as much as military weight. Negotiations at the fort unfolded beneath the shadow of siege works and the river's slow churn. Truces and parleys were arranged under flags or by agreed locations, and interpreters stood at the pivot between cultures and intentions. Hostage-taking, too, became part of the bargaining. Captives were used to secure safe passage, to obtain the release of prisoners, or to pressure leaders into temporary truces. Gifts, blankets, cloth, rum, brass kettles, carried diplomatic meaning. An offer might be genuine or a tactical feint. At times, negotiators spoke of opening trade, at other moments of forging alliances against common enemies. The British aimed to buy time to receive supplies and reinforcements. Native delegations balanced demands for protection of hunting grounds and sovereignty with pragmatic calculations about which colonial power might best safeguard their communities. There is a notorious and contested element to the correspondence that passed through the fort. Primary documents indicate that some British officials discussed, and in one instance implemented the transfer of items taken from a smallpox hospital to visiting native emissaries. A journal entry by a trading agent at the fort records that 2 blankets and a handkerchief were given out of the smallpox hospital to visiting leaders. Another set of letters from a senior commander suggested, in blunt terms, the possibility of using disease as a weapon against disaffected tribes. These surviving writings are stark in tone and raw in intent. They show that some commanders at least discussed biological means as part of their strategic repertoire. At the same time, historians emphasize caution. The presence of correspondence does not by itself resolve questions about how effectively such attempts propagated disease, nor about the broader chain of contagion in a frontier environment already subject to episodic epidemics. Scholars continue to parse these documents and to place them within a matrix of other contemporary facts. Some historians read those orders and journal entries as explicit evidence of attempted biological warfare. Others observed that disease dynamics on the frontier were complex. People moved, goods moved, and infections could arrive by many vectors. The outbreak patterns that followed cannot be attributed with certainty to a single act without a careful reading of epidemiological and documentary records. This contested reading matters because it reshapes how we understand the interplay of military strategy and moral decision-making in frontier conflict. The debate is not merely academic. It is about the ways commanders weighed expediency against restraint when civilian and military lives hung in the balance. Tactically, messages were used to manipulate timing and perception. A request for a parley could be genuine or a ruse to draw defenders out. The promise of a relief column could dissuade an attack. False reports could be planted to cause confusion. Inside the fort, commanders debated how much to reveal. They sent misleading reports to lull besiegers or mailed urgent pleas that exaggerated need to secure a faster relief. Conversely, native leaders used their own networks to feed allies' intelligence, who was most poorly supplied, where the colonial detachments were thinest, and which forts had the weakest morale. Strategy on both sides involved reading the enemy's communications as much as protecting one's own. Diplomatic strategies reached beyond simple parleys. Colonial authorities attempted to divide native coalitions by recognizing certain leaders as legitimate interlocutors and by offering selective trade advantages. Promises of rations, tools, and the reopening of established trading posts were tools of persuasion. Native diplomacy was sophisticated. Some groups negotiated to preserve access to key hunting territories. Others used the language of treaty to forestall settlement. Some negotiated ceasefires to allow for disease-afflicted communities to recover or to shift seasons of campaigning. These moves were not uniform. They reflected a multiplicity of goals, differences in political cultures, and the shifting loyalties that characterized the borderlands. At the strategic center, British planners balanced defensive fortification with offensive projection. Fort Pitt itself was a bastion intended to command river traffic and to protect trade arteries. Its leadership therefore had to think beyond immediate defense. If the fort held, it could anchor a recovery. If it fell, supply lines would collapse. This calculus shaped the tone and content of messages. Requests for reinforcements emphasized the fort's strategic necessity. Negotiations framed the British as a reasonable power ready to restore trade and order, while also warning of punitive responses if hostilities continued. That dual posture, carrot and stick, was a deliberate part of the strategy. For the native confederacies pressing the siege, strategy was about stretching the British thin, maintaining pressure across multiple posts, and leveraging symbolic acts to keep momentum. Messages to British officers sometimes included conditions for lifting blockades, withdrawal of men from certain lands, cessation of fort construction, or restitution for raids. At other times, leaders demanded guarantees before releasing captives. Communication thus served tactical ends and broader political objectives simultaneously. Letters and oral messages were crafted to influence not only the immediate interlocutors but also allied audiences, colonial governments, and tribal constituencies. At the human level, the language of negotiation bore ritual and restraint. Ceremonial exchanges accompanied messages. Smoking a ceremonial pipe, for example, might open a parley. A refusal could close it. These rituals structured expectations and reduced the chance that a single mistranslated phrase would explode into violence. Skilled interpreters and mediators were therefore indispensable. They carried more than words. They ferried the history of prior bargains, the weight of insults, and the memory of past grievances. When they failed, miscommunication could prove fatal. When they succeeded, temporary peace followed, but often only until strategic priorities shifted on one side or the other. In assessing intent and outcome, later analysis must weigh motive, method, and effect. The correspondence shows that some officers entertained morally fraught options as plausible military measures. That fact cannot be denied. Whether those measures succeeded in producing the large-scale epidemics that some accounts imply remains a question for interdisciplinary study. Epidemiologists, archivists, and historians together have reconstructed movement maps, camp logs, and health records to test causal chains. Their results underscore the limits of documentary evidence in reconstructing disease spread over a scattered frontier, while also underscoring the real human choices recorded in the surviving letters. As hostilities eased, the language of negotiation morphed into the language of settlement and control. Messages trading on military threat evolved into treaties and proclamations that sought to regulate settlement, trade, and the presence of forts. Those later documents drew on the memory of earlier siege parleys. They aimed to codify boundaries, but they also carried the imprint of the strategies and missteps that had characterized the siege itself. Both sides used messages to shape the narrative of what had happened. to justify actions taken and to assert rights going forward. Reading these episodes closely reveals a landscape in which words, like cannon and musket, changed outcomes. Messages could delay attacks, secure rations, or precipitate escalations. Negotiations could spare lives or be used to mask intentions. Strategy encompassed fortification and field maneuvers, but it also reached into the realm of persuasion, psychological pressure, and moral calculation. The exchange of letters, gifts, and envoys at Fort Pitt shows how diplomacy and military planning were braided together in the grim arithmetic of frontier conflict. Thank you for listening to this examination of how communication, bargaining, and planning shaped one of the most fraught moments on the frontier. If you found this close reading helpful, first hope you will subscribe for further explorations of the complicated choices people made when war, diplomacy, and survival met. The smallpox controversy. What records suggest? When British officers recorded that they had given 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken from the smallpox hospital to native emissaries, a note was struck that would echo for centuries. Hello, thank you for listening. If you value careful historical inquiry, please consider subscribing for more. The surviving papers from the garrison and from senior officers on the frontier make clear that the idea of using disease as an instrument of war was discussed, and that at least one small, tangible act was recorded in the fort's own journal. The documentary backbone of the controversy rests on a handful of primary documents. One is a trade and garrison journal kept at the fort that records the distribution of blankets and a handkerchief taken from the smallpox sick room and handed to representatives of surrounding communities. Another is a set of letters exchanged among senior British officers and administrators in which smallpox is explicitly proposed as a weapon against hostile groups. These letters show that the possibility of transmitting smallpox was not a casual thought. It was debated among people who directed military operations on the frontier. Different writers used different language, some clinical, some casual, but the intent is plainly visible in their correspondence. Those records also reveal an awareness of contemporary medical practice. Officers and physicians of the time were familiar with inoculation and with the contagious nature of smallpox. They maintained a smallpox hospital at the fort precisely because they knew the disease could spread. That context matters. Giving bedding or clothing from a place where smallpox patients had been cared for was not an act taken in ignorance of contagion. The British correspondence shows that the idea of using infected material to spread disease was contemplated as a stratagem. The garrison account shows one instance where items known to be associated with sick patients were handed over. Taken together, these raw sources establish both intent and action at the level of the fort. The question that has occupied historians is not only whether there was intent, but also whether those words and acts produced the epidemic outcomes that followed. Contemporary reports from the frontier and subsequent accounts by tribal communities record outbreaks of smallpox in nearby nations in the months after the fort incident. Some colonial dispatches likewise describe rising disease among allied and hostile indigenous people. But correlation is not causation. Smallpox was already a recurring and mobile hazard in eastern North America because of trade routes, population movements, and previous waves of infection. Traders, migrants, soldiers, and other forts all provided pathways for a virus that spreads efficiently through close contact. For every document that links smallpox cases temporally to gifts at the fort, there are other plausible vectors that could have introduced or amplified the disease independently. Epidemiologically, transmission by contaminated clothing or bedding is biologically plausible but not as efficient as person-to-person respiratory spread. Medical literature of the period and later research show that viable variola virus could survive on linens and therefore serve as a vehicle for infection, especially when the materials came directly from a patient's bed. Nevertheless, the level of risk depends on how recently the items were used by an infected person and how they were handled. A recorded handing over of blankets does not, by itself, document successful transfer of infection. It documents an action that could have been infectious under the right circumstances. That distinction forms the core of scholarly debate. Another important set of records offers a window onto intent at higher levels. Correspondence from senior commanders and colonial officials makes clear that using smallpox as a tool against hostile groups was contemplated beyond the immediate fort. These letters include proposals to exploit the disease and responses approving attempts to introduce it among disaffected populations. That material demonstrates that the idea was not isolated to a single garrison clerk or officer. It circulated among policymakers who controlled troop movements and supplies. In historical terms, that is significant because it places the Fort Pitt Act within a broader pattern of thinking about unconventional methods of warfare on the frontier. At the same time, some contemporary officers expressed caution or skepticism about such methods. and not all who discussed the possibility followed through. Later reports from commanders who faced outbreaks sometimes describe efforts to isolate the sick, to control contaminated items, and to trace contacts. These administrative reactions complicate any simple narrative of an intentional, systematic biological offensive. The documentary record therefore contains both pointed examples of malevolent planning and administrative records, showing that commanders also address contagion in ways meant to limit its spread among their own troops and civilians. Native accounts and oral histories contribute an essential perspective that often does not fit neatly into colonial paperwork. Several indigenous communities pass down memories of deliberate attempts to spread smallpox, and those memories have been corroborated in different oral traditions. These testimonies emphasize intent, the experience of receiving goods that then brought illness, and the social and political aftermath in their communities. Scholars must weigh such testimony alongside written records that were produced by the colonizing power, recognizing that silence in colonial files does not equal absence of effect or intent. The formal archives, the private correspondence, and the oral histories together create a fuller, though still contested, picture. Modern historians who have sifted these materials tend to divide the question into two parts: proof of intent and proof of effect. Proof of intent is stronger. The combination of explicit suggestions in correspondence and the recorded distribution of items from the smallpox hospital supports the conclusion that at least some British actors intended to use smallpox as a weapon. Proof of effect, that the Fort Pitt exchange directly caused the subsequent large-scale epidemics that devastated indigenous populations in the region, remains harder to establish conclusively. Part of the difficulty is the fragmentary nature of epidemiological records from frontier regions, and part is the multiplicity of plausible infectious pathways active at the time. Scholarly analysis that leans toward deliberate transmission as a key factor points to timing and the concentration of outbreaks in groups known to have received contact, noting that disease dynamics on small, susceptible populations can be explosive. Critics of this line, meanwhile, demonstrate that trade networks, refugee movements, and prior exposure could account for the spread without invoking a single contaminated exchange as the principal cause. Both arguments deploy the same core documents. They differ primarily in how those documents are weighted against broader epidemiological and social evidence. Scientific studies informing the debate bring additional nuance. Microbiological knowledge about variola survivability on fabrics and the conditions that favor fomite transmission buttress the plausibility of the Fort Pitt action leading to infection. But molecular epidemiology that might trace the lineage of a particular smallpox outbreak back to a single source is not available for that period at the resolution needed to settle the question. Smallpox strains from 18th century outbreaks rarely leave recoverable genetic material, and when they do not always allow for fine-grained source attribution. So modern science can clarify mechanisms but cannot always connect the documentary act to a specific chain of infections. The legal and ethical framing of the incident has shifted over time, and historians writing today generally place the Fort Pitt documents within a longer pattern of frontier violence and dispossession. That larger context helps explain why the correspondents advocating the use of disease should be taken seriously. The mindset that authorized brutal tactics in warfare extended to questions of health and contagion. Yet historians also caution against conflating the presence of malicious intent with incontrovertible proof of causation for every epidemic that followed. The records suggest will and opportunity. They stop short of demonstrating, in every case, that those words produced the demographic catastrophes later attributed to them. Specific examples in the archives illustrate how ambiguous the trail can be. One Garrison Journal entry describes the literal transfer of items from the sick to outsiders. A separate letter from a senior officer questions whether smallpox could be introduced among hostile tribes and solicits practical suggestions. Another response from a field commander reports cases of disease among nearby communities some weeks later. Taken together, these pieces form a circumstantial chain: idea, action, and subsequent disease. What links remain missing, and therefore contested, are the definitive epidemiological data that would trace particular infections directly to those items rather than to some other contact. It is also important to stress that colonial medical practice itself contained contradictions that complicate interpretation. Officers who experimented with inoculation or who tried to use contaminated materials sometimes did so under the conceptual frameworks of their day, which mixed empirical observation with limited theoretical understanding. The fact that some British personnel used variolation to protect their own soldiers shows that they were engaged with contemporary techniques for managing disease. That engagement coexisted with a readiness among some to weaponize the very same knowledge. The records thus reveal both practical public health measures and morally fraught calculus. When historians present the Fort Pitt episode in classrooms and public history, they often emphasize the archival certainty of intent while acknowledging the epidemiological uncertainty of effect. That balanced reading respects both the documentary evidence and the limits of what those documents can prove. It also keeps open space for Indigenous testimony, which may identify outcomes no colonial ledger recorded. By listening to multiple kinds of evidence, the story the records suggest becomes richer and more credible, even if it remains uncomfortable and incomplete. In the end, the surviving documents point to a grim calculus on the frontier, a willingness among some British officers to contemplate and even attempt to use disease as a weapon, and an instance in which contaminated items were handed over in circumstances that neither the giver nor the recipients could fully control. The records do not provide a clean verdict on whether that act was the pivotal cause of later epidemics. What they do offer is clear proof that biological aggression was considered and practiced on at least one occasion, and that the consequences, whether direct or indirect, were felt deeply by Indigenous communities. The debate among historians continues, informed by new archival discoveries, re-examinations of old sources, and the persistent testimony of communities whose memories keep the episode alive. Immediate outcomes and withdrawal. When the pressure on the fort finally eased, the first signs of what the siege had wrought were practical and immediate. Empty fields, weakened supply lines, and a garrison that had learned the cost of being cut off from easy support. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this kind of close reading helpful, consider subscribing for more stories like this. The people inside and outside the palisades stepped into an altered frontier. Military relief arrived in force not as a cinematic parade but as a hard, logistical response. A British column pushed along the same crooked rivers and rough trails that had enabled the defenders to hold on, and their success in a nearby engagement broke the encirclement. The men who reached the fort did so after a fight that forced the besiegers to withdraw rather than risk being trapped between field army and fort. Casualties on both sides had been inflicted earlier and in the relief action, but the immediate tactical picture became one of British control reasserted. Soldiers that had been stretched thin received reinforcements. Ammunition chests were opened and stores redistributed. That did not, however, reweave the frontier back into its previous fabric overnight. Disease, already lurking at the margins, moved to the center of attention almost at once. Smallpox was a real and present danger in the settlement, and it had been inside the fort before the siege was wholly lifted. Several contemporary accounts from inside the fort refer to smallpox in the garrison and among prisoners and refugees who had gathered within its walls. A trader's journal entry recorded the distribution of a small number of items taken from the fort's smallpox hospital to visiting native emissaries, and that entry, sparse and plain, became a focal point for later debates. Some officers in command, and others in the wider imperial administration, discussed or even suggested aggressive measures to spread disease among hostile groups, while later historians have argued over whether these contemporaneous plans amounted to deliberate biological warfare or crude opportunism in a desperate war. The fact of the journal entry exists. How causation should be drawn from it remains contested. Historians and ethicists still wrestle with the implications. On the ground, communities beyond the walls were already changing as a direct consequence. Many settlers who had remained in outlying cabins fled toward fortified settlements at the first news of relief. Some returned to find barns burned and stores pilfered. Native bands that had participated in the siege dispersed, in some cases taking the wounded and the dead with them, in others lingering on the margins to harry supply lines. The immediate demographic impact among native peoples varied by nation and location. Epidemic disease did not respect political boundaries. Where smallpox, whether introduced intentionally, accidentally, or already present, took hold, the results could be rapid and devastating, reducing fighting strength and destabilizing group leadership. Where disease did not take root, pressure still remained from the reprisal raids and the looming presence of regular troops. The British military response after the siege was not limited to immediate reinforcement. Patrols increased and supply convoys became better protected. Fortifications along the frontier were strengthened or rebuilt, and engineers made practical alterations to improve defense and internal sanitation, lessons learned in wartime. Officers who had been under siege documented what had been wasted and what had survived. A few of those documents, quartermaster inventories and after-action notes, show how much emphasis was placed on logistics, food, medicine, and the capacity to move men quickly. It was logistics, arguing some voices in command, that had won the day more than any single act in the garrison. The strategic implication was clear. On a contested frontier, supply and relief were as decisive as muskets. For native parties, the choices presented themselves in stark terms. Some leaders chose to seek terms and open negotiations, partly because the pressure of disease and the arrival of field armies made sustained sieges risky. Others retreated to their winter territories to regroup, hunting grounds and kin networks offering a buffer that a fort could not match. Hostage-taking, an established diplomatic practice in many native traditions, continued as a bargaining tool in the weeks after the relief. Captives were exchanged at agreed-upon councils and through back-channel negotiations. Those exchanges were healing in a narrow way, but they did not erase the structural drivers of conflict: contested land, competing economic systems, and mutual mistrust. The cultural and legal fallout began quickly, too. Colonial authorities, in the face of angry settlers and fractious provincial assemblies, debated whether to push harder into the interior or to pull back and build a line of control. The answer was not uniform across imperial administrations. Some officials favored punitive expeditions that would seek to punish and deter. Others argued for restraint and for measures designed to stabilize relations through negotiated boundaries. The British government, which had been forced to commit more troops and more money to the frontier war than it had planned, began to recalibrate policy. That recalibration included plans to formalize the boundary between colony and Indian country, to concentrate settlement inward, and to use treaties and garrisons to freeze lines of control. Not all consequences were immediate in the legal sense, but the social memory was. In settler communities, the story passed along in plain speech emphasized vulnerability and heroism. Small forts saved lives, and relief columns cut danger short. Oral histories and family letters preserve scenes of hurried evacuations, midnight rides to warn neighbors, and small acts of kindness toward wounded compatriots. Native oral traditions recorded different emphasis: disruption, loss, and the ways in which alliances shifted and kin networks were displaced. Both sets of memories informed later politics on the frontier. Those memories were translated into petitions to colonial assemblies, into pleas for more forts, and into requests for annuities and trade goods meant to secure peaceful relations. The urgent, practical politics of getting by, securing wood, food, and a place to store seed, drove immediate decisions even as long-term strategies were drafted in far-off offices. The question of culpability and intent around the distribution of contaminated items has animated scholarship and popular conversation for a long time. Contemporary officers kept regular correspondence, and these letters show language that, to modern eyes, is chilling. One senior official wrote in a private note that it might be worth trying to inoculate hostile tribes. The word choice and the attitude behind it have been read as evidence of malicious intent. Other documents complicate that picture. Some officers recommended quarantine measures, others advocated for humanitarian aid, and still others sought to use established diplomatic channels to bring adversaries to the table. The contested documentary record needs careful reading. Scholars have pointed out that the technology and understanding of disease at the time were imperfect, that many believed smallpox could be spread by objects, and that anxiety, fear, and a desire to end the conflict quickly shaped decision-making. Those factors do not remove the moral ambiguity, but they do place it in context. Public health on the frontier suddenly became a political question. Governors, military surgeons, and civilian physicians debated containment strategies in letters and in meetings. Makeshift hospitals, or hospital wards within forts, struggled with limited medicine and little understanding of contagion prevention by modern standards. Some commanders tightened quarantine rules for new arrivals. Others prioritized men who could stand sentry duty. In communities outside the forts, families improvised isolation by moving sick relatives to remote cabins or by temporarily abandoning dwellings. Practicalities dominated: who was left to tend livestock, who could guard a field, who would store grain, and such questions shaped whether a household survived the winter. The immediate economic outcomes were visible and raw. Crops had been neglected during prolonged danger. Milling schedules were disrupted. Trade at frontier posts slowed or became more circumspect. Merchants who had supplied forts sometimes found their debts unpaid, while speculators and opportunistic traders profited from shortages. The fur trade adjusted, too. Native traders who had been allied to the British by trade ties sometimes found those ties frayed, and some shifted allegiances or sought credit from other colonial interests. That economic reshuffling affected communities for seasons afterward, and fed into broader imperial debates about the viability of Western expansion. On the diplomatic front, the respite that the lifting of the siege provided was used in multiple ways. British and colonial officials called councils with native leaders, sometimes in the same forts and sometimes at neutral locations. These councils could be pragmatic, exchanging prisoners, arranging compensation for stolen goods, or they could aim at broader peace. Some native leaders used council spaces to press demands for boundaries and for restitution. Others used the time to negotiate for trade goods or guarantees of non-aggression. The uneven outcome of these talks reflected uneven power. Where troops and fortifications loomed, the British could set terms that favoured their interests. Where native confederacies held sway locally, their bargaining position remained strong. A striking short-term consequence was the psychological effect on both sides. Soldiers who had been under siege developed a hardened sense that frontier service would require constant vigilance. Some asked for transfers. Others saw promotion through their endurance. Native warriors who had participated in the siege and subsequent raids returned to communities with heightened reputations, or, where disease or loss had been severe, with diminished status. That rearrangement of prestige could alter leadership patterns and decision-making within nations. The memory of having held or having been pushed from a position of strength or of vulnerability informed subsequent diplomacy and warfare. The legal and ethical questions raised by events during and immediately after the siege did not remain abstract. In the weeks and months that followed, lawyers and officials in the colonies debated compensation for settlers who had lost property, the legality of reprisals, and the proper procedure for negotiating with native nations. Those debates sought frameworks to handle what had been messy and anno domini hoc, reprisals that crossed property lines, trader accounts that were left unpaid, and the status of captives who had been taken in multiple incidents across the frontier. Some colonial courts ordered compensation or martial commissions. Others deferred to military judgment. The practical fact remained that law on the frontier often bowed to force and necessity, at least in the immediate aftermath. Memory and meaning were shaped not only by documents but by material culture. Fort walls that had splinter marks and gatehouses in need of repair became silent testimony to the siege. Traders salvaged barrels and household goods left in haste. Some items, letters, a musket, a medical ledger, were preserved and passed down, carrying with them the human texture of what had occurred. These objects helped later generations imagine the siege, but they also framed the narrative toward particular themes: endurance, betrayal, and resilience. Where objects were displayed in public halls or in family parlors, they helped shape a communal sense of what had been lost and what had been defended. Longer-term strategic thinking in colonial offices incorporated lessons drawn from those immediate outcomes. Military planners emphasized the necessity of mobile columns that could relieve distant posts, and administrators stressed the political need to stabilize relations to prevent recurrent sieges. The balance between punitive expeditions and negotiated settlements became a recurring policy debate. Some officials favored fortifying a line and discouraging settler encroachment beyond it. Others argued that settlers who were turned back would only become more anxious and that expansion would sooner or later resume. The economic pressure of migration into Western lands made reversal impractical in the long run, and the immediate choices after the siege only delayed, rather than ended, the larger processes at work. Across the spectrum of actors, soldiers, traders, settlers, and native leaders, the siege and its aftermath altered everyday calculations. Where once a farm might have been considered sustainable on the frontier margin, the experience of raids and the need to move livestock to safer pastures made subsistence planning more communal and more oriented to defense. Community organizations formed around watch rotations and supply caches. In some places, families consolidated into larger clusters for mutual aid. In others, the loss of key kin to disease or conflict broke households and led to migration away from the frontier altogether. Finally, the contested meaning of certain actions, particularly the distribution of items from the hospital to native visitors, ensured that the siege retained a strong moral valence for generations to come. Some saw those acts as pragmatic and desperate, others as deliberately malevolent. The documents that survive show intentions of many kinds: clinical notes, offhand remarks, and carefully argued proposals. They document fear, calculation, and confusion in equal measure. Contemporary readers must weigh those sources against the corroborating evidence of disease patterns and oral testimony. The immediate outcomes were thus both tangible: reinforcement, withdrawal of besiegers, broken fields, and altered trade, and intangible, a heightened awareness of human vulnerability, a recalibration of diplomacy, and an unresolved question about responsibility that history continues to debate. The withdrawal of the besieging forces did not return the frontier to its prior quiet. Instead, it created a new set of beginnings, some hopeful, some fractured. People rebuilt where they could. Others quit the ground for good. Official policy shifted in measured directions. Memories hardened into stories that would influence later generations. In that way, the siege's immediate outcomes were as much about the decisions made in the aftermath as they were about the shots fired on the palisade. Both the fort and the surrounding country carried the imprint, visible in burned fences and in the correspondence of officers, but also felt in the tender work of recovery and in conversations about what lines, literal and moral, would govern the contested frontier going forward. Ethical debate and historical uncertainty. Outside the palisades of Fort Pitt, a brief journal entry and a terse exchange of letters would ignite a long argument about intent, responsibility, and the shape of truth itself. Hello, thank you for listening. If you find this account worth your time, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful history. A trader and militia officer recorded handing over 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken from the fort hospital to native emissaries who had come under the walls. Around the same time, correspondence between senior British officers discussed using disease as a weapon against disaffected tribes. Those fragments of paper form the spine of a contested story. Did colonial authorities deliberately weaponize smallpox, or are we reading modern motives into desperate wartime choices? The question moves beyond one fort to the long and often brutal entanglements of empire and frontier, and it refuses to settle easily. The documentary record is clear in parts and maddeningly hazy in others. One set of documents records suggestions and responses that, when read plainly, appear to contemplate spreading smallpox. Another record records an action that may have been an attempted biological infection. Taken together, they show that the idea was at least entertained and that some small, physical act, a transfer of cloth from a sick room, did take place. Yet the gap between suggestion and proven outcome is where most historians take their stand. Some argue that the documented intent, combined with the practicality of transmitting smallpox through contaminated bedding, makes deliberate infection likely. Others point out that the disease was already moving through the region by multiple routes, that contagion through trade and seasonal movement is epidemiologically plausible, and that no definitive causal chain connects that specific small exchange to any particular outbreak among native communities. Assessing intent demands careful attention to language and context. A single phrase in a commanding officer's letter can read as a calculated strategy or as bitter wartime speculation, depending on tone, audience, and prevailing assumptions about available means. Military correspondence of the time is often blunt. Officers spoke in terms we now find shocking, and colonial warfare operated under norms that accepted harsh measures. Still, suggestions that read like deliberate proposals to spread disease clash with modern sensibilities and legal norms. Scholars wrestle with whether such proposals were merely rhetorical, intended to intimidate or to prompt discussion of harsh reprisals, or whether they were earnest designs meant to be enacted. The physical plausibility of disease transmission via fomites, objects like blankets and clothing, is also debated. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, transmits most effectively by close face-to-face contact and via respiratory droplets. Yet historical and medical literature acknowledges that contaminated bedding and scabs can carry viable virus particles under certain conditions. Some contemporary experts and historians argue that the exchange of material directly from a smallpox ward into hands that would be carried into encampments made deliberate contagion technically possible. Critics counter that the survival of the virus on textiles depends on environmental factors and handling, and that a single exchange would have been an unreliable vector compared with the many other, more plausible pathways for disease to travel across a landscape of trade, displacement, and intertribal contact. The historiography of this episode has shifted over time, reflecting changing methodologies and priorities. Early narratives often downplayed the episode or framed it within a larger, inevitable story of colonial collision. Later scholars, especially those attentive to indigenous perspectives and the moral dimensions of empire, gave the document sharper scrutiny and foregrounded questions of intention and culpability. At the same time, epidemiologists and biological historians brought laboratory evidence into the conversation, testing claims about fomite survival and transmission dynamics. Each disciplinary lens adds clarity in some areas and new uncertainties in others. When archives speak, they do so incompletely. When the biological record speaks, it speaks in probabilities rather than certainties. Oral histories and indigenous testimony complicate and enrich the archive. For many native communities, the memory of disease and of what felt like deliberate harm is not simply a historiographical puzzle but a lived history passed through generations. That testimony often emphatically asserts intentionality and links actions around Fort Pitt to a pattern of violence and dispossession. Historians who privilege written records sometimes treat these oral accounts as supplemental evidence, while indigenous scholars and community historians insist that oral tradition must be treated as central. Reconciling different evidentiary standards is not merely an academic exercise. It shapes how the past is acknowledged in public memory, education, and policy. Methodological caution matters because this episode feeds modern debates about accountability and reparations. If colonial officials deliberately attempted to spread smallpox, then ethical and legal questions arise about responsibility and redress. If, on the other hand, evidence supports the conclusion that disease spread through complex, unintended vectors, then the moral framing shifts towards structural violence inherent in colonization, displacement, famine, and the collapse of social networks that magnify disease impacts. Both interpretations implicate imperial policies and attitudes that devalued indigenous lives, but they point to different forms of historical responsibility and different avenues for contemporary acknowledgement. The archival record invites scrutiny about provenance, context, and translation. Military letters passed between officers in distant posts, clerks copied and sometimes summarized. Journals were private but have their own agendas. Handwriting is difficult. Paper wears. Phrases may be idiomatic to an era that thought differently about contagion. Archivists trace chain of custody. Historians cross-reference contemporaneous logs, civilian accounts, and native testimonies. Even so, there are yawning silences, pages never written, perspectives never recorded, voices that vanished with the dead. Those silences can be filled only cautiously, with an awareness of what kinds of claims the surviving documents can legitimately support. Some scholars treat the episode as an early instance of biological warfare, pointing to the explicit suggestion in a commanding general's letter and to the journal entry documenting the transfer from the hospital. They see a direct line from intent to act. They often situate the case within a larger pattern of colonial violence that includes forced removals, scorched earth tactics, and treaty violations. Others urge restraint, noting that contemporaneous epidemics could and did spread through contact networks every bit as well as through deliberate acts. They emphasize that a deliberate attempt is harder to prove than an expressed willingness to contemplate it, and that conflating rhetorical violence with operational success risks overstating the evidence. The ethical debates spill into how museums, educators, and civic leaders present the past. Should exhibits name deliberate intent? Should school curricula teach this as a case of early biological warfare, or as a cautionary example of how colonial violence took many forms, some deliberate and some structural? Communities differ in their answers. Some demand a clear indictment of imperial actors. Others prefer a narrative that emphasizes complexity and shared tragedy. Those disagreements reflect deeper tensions about how societies reconcile with painful histories and about who gets to tell them. Legal scholars and ethicists have also weighed in, not to adjudicate the past but to consider the implications of classification. Labeling the episode as biological warfare carries doctrinal weight and moral condemnation. But applying present-day legal categories to 18th century actions raises questions about anachronism. At the same time, refusing to assign contemporary moral judgments risks minimizing harm. Many ethicists approach the problem by distinguishing between culpability for deliberate acts and responsibility for systems that enabled catastrophic outcomes. That distinction alters prescriptions for redress. Apologies, reparations, and institutional reforms respond to different understandings of historical wrongdoing. Scientific research interacts with these debates in tangible ways. Advances in paleovirology and ancient DNA techniques raise the possibility, however slim, of recovering pathogen genetic material from archaeological contexts. If successful, such work could help map the spread of smallpox strains across regions and provide firmer links between outbreaks and potential vectors. But the conditions necessary for recovering viable viral DNA are exacting, and ethical constraints around excavating human remains mean that many communities will resist such research unless it proceeds under collaborative terms and with consent. The promise of hard science is tempered by practical limits and by the need to respect living descendants. Public discourse tends to simplify. Sensational headlines reduce nuance and sometimes conflate possibility with proof. That simplification fuels both righteous indignation and defensive denial, hardening positions and making constructive conversation harder. Careful historians strive to resist that polarization by presenting the range of plausible interpretations and by being transparent about evidentiary limits. They also acknowledge the moral outrage that naturally flows from the documents themselves. Evidence of callousness, or even rhetorical willingness to inflict disease, is morally salient whether or not the specific act caused the predicted outcome. Scholarly debate also highlights differences in what counts as evidence. For many historians, a clear, contemporaneous statement of deliberate intent coupled with demonstrable events that follow is sufficient. For others, epidemiological reconstruction and the testimony of affected communities must carry equal weight. Some historians advocate for interdisciplinary panels that bring together archivists, epidemiologists, indigenous scholars, and ethicists to investigate such cases holistically. Those teams can assess the likelihood of transmission via formities, contextualize letters within military practice, and interpret oral histories in light of cultural memory. Memory and reconciliation frame the practical consequences of uncertainty. Communities seeking recognition of historical harms often find that uncertainty about particulars does not erase the experience of loss and injustice. Whether the act at Fort Pitt was a single malicious deed or one example among many forms of structural violence, the result for many Native peoples was loss, displacement, and generational trauma. Addressing those consequences calls for responses that move beyond forensic certainty: public acknowledgement, dialogue, restitution where possible, and institutional changes that honor historical truth as remembered by communities most affected. In classrooms and public forums, this episode becomes a case study in the ethics of historical interpretation. It teaches students to weigh primary sources against secondary analyses, to interrogate bias, and to understand how moral frameworks shape historical questions. It also teaches humility. Sometimes archives provide partial answers, sometimes the past resists tidy moral classifications. That discomfort can be productive, prompting communities and scholars to collaborate in reconstructing events with both rigor and empathy. Finally, there is an ongoing, human dimension that never fully appears in documents or debates: how people lived with uncertainty, with loss, and with the memory of what may or may not have been done to them. For some families and communities, oral history preserves an account of deliberate harm that shapes identity and political action. For historians, that living memory is both evidence and moral claim. Engaging with that reality means listening as much as analyzing, and bringing archival judgment into conversation with contemporary needs for recognition and healing. The papers that survived from Fort Pitt are small and can feel brittle. They are enough to start a story, but not always enough to end one. The ethical debates they inspire are not merely academic. They shape how societies remember, how victims seek redress, and how future generations learn to name and respond to historical wrongs. The uncertainty itself, the careful weighing of what is probable, possible, or provable, is part of the work of history. It keeps the past from collapsing into tidy narratives, and keeps the present attentive to the consequences of words and deeds across time. Thank you for staying with this careful, complicated inquiry. If you'd like more episodes that probe difficult questions and balance archival evidence with respectful listening, please subscribe. How the Story Shaped Frontier Memory. When representatives of the Ohio country approached the wooden palisades of that frontier fort, they received more than conversation. What passed over the walls became a story that would travel farther than any single messenger. Hello, thank you for listening. If you find careful and balanced history valuable, please consider subscribing for more. The documented exchange of contaminated cloth by officers and traders, recorded in contemporary journals and correspondence, is the kernel around which layers of memory have accreted on both sides of the frontier. Contemporary records are specific. A trader kept an entry describing the handing over of 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken from the smallpox hospital to emissaries who had come under a flag of truce. The correspondence between senior officers in the Imperial Army shows discussion, and even encouragement of using smallpox as a tool against resisting tribes. Those documents do not stand alone. They intersect with reports of an epidemic sweeping indigenous communities in the same season. Yet linking a single act to a complex outbreak requires care. Historians and epidemiologists point out that indigenous populations already faced multiple vectors of contagion from trade, movement, and the mingled hardships of war. Some argue the transfer at the fort was an isolated atrocity, albeit a well-documented one. Others maintain it was part of a broader pattern of biological strategy contemplated and sometimes attempted by officials. The disagreement matters because memory is shaped as much by what people assert as by what they can prove. For Native communities, the story did important, lasting work. It confirmed and amplified experiences of betrayal. Oral histories passed through generations record not only loss but also moral lessons about trust and diplomacy with armed outsiders. The Fort episode became emblematic in Indigenous memory of how envoys and truce parleys could be instruments of harm rather than safe rights. These narratives fed into decisions on alliances and resistance in the years that followed and helped to explain why many communities treated treaties, gifts, and negotiation with profound caution. Memory here functions as social knowledge. It teaches how to read the intentions behind outward civilities, and it preserves a caution that is practical as much as it is moral. The story thus operated as a form of communal instruction, refining patterns of engagement on the frontier. Among settlers and imperial authorities, the story moved differently. Early British and colonial accounts tended to frame frontier violence as reciprocal savagery, or they minimized the moral weight of such actions by emphasizing military necessity. Later 19th century histories often sanitized imperial behavior, crafting national narratives that favored expansion and framed indigenous resistance as obstacles to progress. Yet even within those currents, the fort incident proved difficult to erase entirely. Critics of frontier expansion and later writers concerned with ethics and legality pointed to the documented exchange as a clear instance where imperial actors contemplated methods that would now be seen as chemical or biological warfare. The story supplied ammunition to reformers and to those questioning the moral foundations of conquest. It seeded doubt in public memory about the righteousness of frontier conquests, even as dominant narratives tried to bury that doubt under triumphalist history. Museums, schoolbooks, and public commemorations have treated the incident unevenly, and those choices have themselves shaped frontier memory. Where local museums incorporated the episode into exhibits, they often did so by juxtaposing the documentary evidence with indigenous testimonies, forcing visitors to confront competing accounts and ethical implications. Elsewhere, the event was omitted or minimized, which allowed a different memory, the comfortable, heroic eastward-pushing story, to persist. This selective remembrance has consequences. When public memory foregrounds certain episodes and hides others, it reshapes civic understanding of legitimate violence, whose harms are acknowledged, and who is remembered as a wrongdoer. The fort episode thus became a litmus test for regional memory politics. Include it, and the past looks morally ambiguous. Exclude it, and the past glows with undisturbed justification. The story's persistence into modern debates shows how frontier memory is never inert. In scholarly debates, legal discussions, and public conversations about reconciliation, the fort incident is invoked as an early example of attempted biological warfare on American soil. That framing has ethical weight and policy relevance today because it ties historical practice to contemporary norms prohibiting biological weapons. Advocates for indigenous rights have used the episode to question long-standing governmental attitudes and to argue that historic wrongs carry forward into present inequalities. Conversely, defenders of imperial actors sometimes stress ambiguity in causation. Epidemics were complex, and singular acts cannot be confidently isolated as the principal cause of demographic catastrophe. Both positions rely on the same archival sources but reach different moral and political conclusions. The contested reading itself is part of frontier memory. People remember not a single narrative but a field of interpretation. Personal stories and local traditions enriched and complicated the public record. Families and communities on the frontier told versions of the exchange that emphasized intent, timing, and consequence in ways that suited local experiences. In some oral traditions, the act at the fort is a turning point. The moment trust was irrevocably broken. In settler family histories, it is sometimes mentioned as a regrettable wartime calculation or omitted entirely. This divergence illustrates an important dynamic. Memory at the frontier is layered and often compartmentalized, with neighboring communities holding incompatible recollections that nonetheless coexist. Over time, those differences became embedded in local rituals, commemorations, and political stances, shaping how generations understood the meaning of law, treaty, and hospitality. The way historians handle the fort incident has also influenced public perception. Early historians who favored imperial perspectives often described the frontier as a collision of civilizations in which hard choices were necessary. Mid-century and later scholars, however, began to scrutinize the moral choices of empire more sharply, framing actions at the fort as evidence of a willingness to employ disease as a weapon. The methodological shift, placing indigenous experiences, oral testimony, and the moral implications of archival documents at the center of analysis, reoriented how the incident was taught and remembered. Scholarly disputes over causation and intent have not diminished public interest. Instead, they have made the fort exchange a symbol for broader debates about truth and responsibility. The story functions today not merely as history but as a focal point for ethics, law, and communal remembrance. In popular culture, the episode touches deep narrative chords. Writers and filmmakers who have treated frontier history sometimes use the fort exchange to dramatize the moral hazards of colonial violence without dwelling on graphic detail. The incident lends itself to stories that explore trust, betrayal, and the slow accumulation of grievances that can fuel cycles of violence. Because it is documented and morally charged, it invites reflection about the responsibilities of commanders and the human costs of strategic thinking. Those cultural retellings further shape memory by translating archival dry prose into scenes that linger: quiet negotiations, an exchange of goods, a later spread of sickness, and the long echoes of loss. Even when dramatized, the story tends to emphasize ethical ambiguity rather than lurid spectacle, which helps maintain an immersive, reflective tone in public memory. The legal and diplomatic afterlife of the episode is significant. In the long arc of relations between governments and indigenous peoples, documented acts like the one at the fort provide material for claims of breach, bad faith, or war crimes. Historical evidence of deliberate infection bolsters arguments for formal apologies, reparations, or changes in public policy. Conversely, the contested nature of causation complicates legal claims, because assigning responsibility for disease spread is scientifically and historically fraught. This legal ambivalence feeds into frontier memory. Some communities see the documentation as vindication and moral leverage. Others see the lack of incontrovertible causation as an obstacle to redress. The result is a memory that is litigated as much as remembered in speech and story. Educational practices also shape how the incident is remembered. When school curricula include the episode, students are invited to wrestle with sources, motives, and consequences. They learn not only about what happened, but about how historical knowledge is constructed and disputed. In places where curricula ignore or downplay the event, generations grow up with gaps in their understanding of frontier relations and the ethical dilemmas of expansion. The pedagogical choice to teach the episode in context, showing documents, indigenous perspectives, and historiographical debates, fosters a more complex and honest frontier memory. That, in turn, influences public attitudes toward contemporary questions of historical justice. Finally, the fort narrative has a contemporary resonance in the language of memory politics. The episode is cited in conversations about truth-telling, reconciliation, and how societies acknowledge painful pasts. It serves as an early example of the moral complexities that arise when states confront their own violent strategies. Recognizing the story, with its documentation and disputes, forces communities to reckon with uncomfortable facts and to consider the responsibility of memory, to hold the past honestly, to listen to contested voices, and to use historical understanding to inform present policy and interpersonal trust. That is how a single documented act at a wooden palisade grew into a landmark of frontier memory, shaping how people remember who did what, why it mattered, and what lessons linger for those who still live where those old walls once stood. Closing reflection and legacy. Fort Pitt rose where two rivers met, a fortress carved into the western edge of empire and a place where diplomacy, violence, and disease intersected in ways that would echo for generations. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this exploration useful, please consider subscribing for more historical narratives. The siege that unfolded there in 1763 is often recalled for both its military drama and the contested story about attempts to use disease as a weapon. Those twin threads shape much of the site's legacy. The documentary record offers a series of concrete traces. A trader's journal preserved an entry noting that items taken from a hospital were given to native delegates as presents. Correspondence between senior officers includes language that openly discusses the possibility of spreading smallpox among hostile tribes. These primary sources exist as physical evidence, and they anchor the debate. Yet handwriting and ink alone cannot answer every question. The texts place intent and action side by side, and historians have had to read their silences as well as their statements. Scholars from several disciplines have examined the same documents and reached different conclusions. Some argue that the journal note and letters demonstrate a deliberate attempt to employ disease as a weapon, that, in context, the giving of clothing and blankets from a smallpox hospital was an act intended to cause contagion among the recipients. Others caution that the evidence is more ambiguous. They point out that smallpox was already present in the region in the wider population, that transmission dynamics are complex, and that proving causation from one exchange to a broad outbreak crosses the line from history into speculation. The debate is not merely academic. It affects how descendants of those involved remember the past, how museums present artifacts, and how societies judge historical actions against modern ethical standards. Even where agreement has been elusive, the broader consequences of the siege are easier to trace. Relationships between colonial authorities and indigenous nations hardened. Trust eroded in ways that shaped later diplomacy and resistance. Military practices on the frontier changed as well. Commanders learned, with painful clarity, that fighting among civilian populations and trying to control disease were not separable problems. Outposts like Fort Pitt became symbols of imperial reach and of the fraught consequences that accompany contest over land and life. The story of the Fort Pitt episode has also influenced how historians and the public think about biological warfare. It stands as an early case in which military decision-making intersected with disease control and intentionality. Later debates about ethics in warfare, the treatment of non-combatants, and the use of environmental or biological agents have sometimes looked back to this moment for precedent. Legal and moral frameworks that now prohibit biological weapons were shaped over long decades by many cases and considerations, but episodes such as the Fort Pitt correspondence are repeatedly invoked when policymakers and ethicists ask what lessons the past might teach. Memory and commemoration have added another layer. Fort Pitt's ruins and surviving structures lie beneath and among the modern city of Pittsburgh. Museums and historic sites present the siege, the broader conflict, and the contested smallpox story in ways that reflect changing public attitudes. At times, exhibits have foregrounded the military narrative. At other moments, curators have shifted focus toward Indigenous experiences and the long-term impacts on Native communities. Local historians and Indigenous voices have advocated for more inclusive interpretation. There are tangible examples: curated displays that juxtapose commanders' letters with oral histories from tribes whose ancestors lived through the frontier upheavals, programs that invite tribal elders to speak, and public dialogues that grapple with memory, responsibility, and historical trauma. Public conversation about the episode has also illustrated how interpretations change with new evidence and shifting values. In one instance, archival material once obscure to researchers was examined alongside epidemiological studies, and scholars published reassessments that adjusted earlier claims about the effectiveness of any attempted biological transmission. In another, Indigenous scholars and activists emphasized that even if causation remained uncertain, the very suggestion of deliberate infection mattered deeply because it reflected broader patterns of dispossession and violence. This dual recognition, that archival certainty and moral judgment are distinct, has become central to the legacy discussion. There are practical lessons for historians and for the public when dealing with contested episodes like the siege of Fort Pitt. First, primary sources must be read critically and in context. A single journal entry or letter gains meaning only when connected to broader administrative practices, medical knowledge of the time, and the lived realities of the frontier. Second, multidisciplinary approaches are necessary. Combining archival research, epidemiology, anthropology, and Indigenous oral traditions yields a fuller picture than any single method can provide. Third, public history should be accountable and dialogic. Museums, educators, and writers have a responsibility to present uncertainties honestly, to highlight contested interpretations, and to make space for voices that were historically excluded. The siege's legacy also plays out in contemporary debates about how nations confront uncomfortable pasts. There are communities that seek acknowledgement and repair. There are institutions that must reconcile pride in local heritage with recognition of harm done in the name of empire. Examples include collaborative projects that place plaques or create exhibits acknowledging the experiences of Native peoples, and curricular shifts in regional education that treat the frontier conflicts as complex interactions rather than simple stories of conquest. These initiatives are uneven and ongoing. Progress is not linear. For descendants of those who experienced the frontier conflicts, and for residents of the city that grew from Fort Pitt's ruins, the site functions as a place of layered meaning. It is a locus of civic identity. It is also a reminder that places carry memory as much as they carry bricks and soil. Interpretive choices made by curators and civic leaders influence how new generations understand their past. When exhibits present primary documents alongside Indigenous perspectives, they foster critical thinking. When they sanitize or omit, they perpetuate incomplete narratives. On an ethical level, the Fort Pitt episode forces contemporary audiences to ask difficult questions about the use of science in war. What obligations do militaries and governments have when actions taken in conflict have potential to harm civilian populations in ways that extend beyond immediate combat? How should historians balance the need to tell uncomfortable truths with the responsibility to avoid sensationalism? Those questions resonate beyond the 1760s. They matter in discussions about public health, the militarization of science, and the protection of non-combatants in modern conflicts. The story's endurance in public imagination also speaks to the power of narrative. A few lines in a journal and a handful of letters have rippled outward, animated by interpretive frames and by the moral concerns of each generation that revisits them. That dynamic shows the historian's craft at work, shaping fragments into narratives while keeping room for ambiguity. It also shows how memory politics operate, as communities insist on readings of the past that foreground their own identities and injustices. Looking forward, the most constructive legacy may be the insistence on pluralistic remembrance. History need not settle every debate to be useful. Rather, its best contribution is to provide a responsibly sourced account, to surface multiple perspectives, and to encourage civic reflection. When museums mount exhibits that display the same letters alongside indigenous stories, they model an approach to history that is both honest about uncertainty and attentive to harm. When scholars publish accessible revisions that engage public audiences, they help societies confront uncomfortable truths without collapsing into cynicism. The siege of Fort Pitt and the subsequent arguments about disease and intent ultimately compel us to think about responsibility across time. Accountability in the present does not require perfect knowledge of the past. It requires willingness to listen, to update institutional narratives, and to offer reparative measures where appropriate. Communities in and around the old fort have taken different paths toward that end, some by reinterpreting exhibits, others by centering educational programs on indigenous perspectives, and still others by supporting scholarship that brings new documents and analyses into the open. The episode also leaves a more subtle legacy, a cautionary note about the limits of technological or scientific control in situations of war. Disease is not a simple instrument to wield without unpredictable consequences. That lesson has been learned again and again in different contexts. It remains a relevant moral consideration for modern policymaking, whether in military strategy or public health planning. In closing, the Fort Pitt story matters because it is not merely a tale of one siege or one alleged tactic. It is a prism through which we can examine how communities remember, how historians interpret contested evidence, and how ethical frameworks evolve. The archival fragments, the journal entries, the letters, are small objects with large implications. They ask us to be careful readers and conscientious citizens. They invite listening to voices that were marginalized in earlier accounts. Above all, they remind us that the past continues to shape present choices. Thank you for accompanying this reflection. If you appreciated the careful look at these sources and their continuing effects, please subscribe for more historical narratives that connect the past to the decisions we face today. Hello, and thank you for staying with us to the end. As the smoke of battle cleared at Fort Pitt in the spring of 1763, the conflict that had erupted on the frontier left no simple winners. We have traced how military strategy, fragile diplomacy, and the invisible hand of disease intertwined to shape events there and beyond. British commanders faced a stubborn alliance of indigenous nations seeking to defend homelands and livelihoods. A besieged outpost became a bargaining table and a flashpoint in a wider struggle over land, power, and survival. Disease, most painfully and controversially smallpox, entered this story not as a single, decisive weapon but as a force that compounded suffering, complicated command decisions, and accused human actors and institutions of moral and strategic failures. Key points to carry away: the siege was part of a larger pattern of violent encounter on the frontier, set against the backdrop of imperial rivalry and indigenous resistance. The role of disease in those encounters was decisive and tragic, but the historical record resists simple conclusions about intent and method, and the consequences were profound and long-lasting, reshaping settlement, alliances, and memory in ways that still echo in the city that grew from Fort Pitt's place. Where sources conflict, historians must weigh letters, orders, and oral traditions carefully. Where stories hurt, we must listen and acknowledge complexity without smoothing over injustice. This is history that matters because it asks each of us how we recall the past and what we do with that memory now. If you found yourself moved, puzzled, or provoked by what you heard, you are not alone. These are the feelings that keep history alive. Tell us in the comments which aspects surprised you most: the military choices, the medical realities, or the indigenous perspectives that too often remain at the margins. Share your questions, your family stories, or the local memorials you know. Your engagement helps build a fuller picture. If you would like to see more work like this, please consider subscribing. It helps us make balanced, carefully sourced stories that respect contested evidence and human dignity. A like or a share lets other curious viewers find these conversations, and a comment shapes what we cover next. In the coming weeks, we will turn our attention to two related threads. One will follow the wider arc of Pontiac's war across the Great Lakes and Ohio country, listening to voices on all sides of that conflict. The other will examine early colonial medicine and indigenous healing practices, and how communities coped with epidemics without the benefit of modern science. Both pieces will build on the documentary you have just watched and aim to deepen understanding rather than settle every question. History is never finished. It lives in letters and land, in the stones beneath modern streets, and in the conversations we keep having. Fort Pitt's earthworks may be buried beneath pavement, but the decisions made there, and the lives affected, remain part of our shared story. Thank you for spending time with this episode, for thinking through hard questions, and for joining a careful, humane conversation about a difficult past. We'll see you in the next film.